in which Christian faith was once very dominant within the culture, just like Lambeth Palace dominated the landscape around here, which was largely fields and moorlands and so on. But now it sort of feels quite small compared to all these other sort of buildings around. But I guess the question is, does the vision that has inspired the banks and the office blocks, is that a vision that can really sustain people's lives over the long term and give them that sense of wider enchantment, a bigger view of life?
Hello there, welcome to Re-enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen here at Lambeth Palace Library.
Yes, you can find us, this podcast, and heaps of other content at seenandunseen.com.
I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tyndall.
And we are your co-hosts, and this is our very first inaugural episode of the Re-enchanting podcast. Very exciting, isn't it?
Very exciting.
Yes, and what an amazing location to be doing it. This is the top floor of the Lambeth Palace Library, a relatively new building. But you work here, don't you, Belle?
I do work here. I suppose if you're listening to this, you'll have to take our word for it. But it's spectacular. The view is phenomenal. And it blows me away every time. The novelty hasn't worn off yet.
Basically, for those who can't see it on the video, we have the London skyline behind us. Big Ben, the Houses of Parliament, it's all there, and it's absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, what a place to start the podcast. But our very special guest on this first edition of the Re-enchanting podcast is Graham Tomlin.
Well, hello, Justin. Hello, Belle. Nice to see you.
It's great to see you.
You obviously know each other well because Graham's your boss, isn't he, Belle?
Graham is my boss. So this adds an extra level of pressure to proceedings, perhaps.
But I have told Belle she doesn't have to behave. She can ask me anything she wants.
I should make the most of this. This might be the one time.
Your one chance.
My one chance to probe.
And Graham won't be watching you every episode of the podcast either. He's just our special guest on the first edition.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
I shall watch every single one.
Well, I'm sure you will. But
following it closely.
You won't be in the background brooding,
No, that's
to
true.
check that Belle behaves herself.
I won't.
Who knows what could happen?
Yes.
Just to give a little bit of background to you, Graham, you are the former Bishop of Kensington. You've served also as the Principal and President of St Mellitus College, Training College. You're an author. I think your most recent book was titled Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea.
I think the last but one that was. But,
okay.
That was
well, I love the title. Maybe we'll ask you about that a bit later on. And you lead the Centre for Cultural Witness here at Lambeth Palace Library. Seen and Unseen is the website. So do you want to start by sort of telling us what Seen and Unseen is?
Well, Seen and Unseen is the title of a new website which is has the tagline Christian Perspectives on Just About Everything. And it's called that. It's called Seen and Unseen because we're interested in the seen realities, the things that everyone knows about. We're interested in law and economics and politics and housing and architecture and arts and everything else. But we're also interested in the unseen realities that make sense of the seen. The world of God and the Trinity and the spiritual and the mysterious and the mystical and those things that very often get missed out on kind of your regular opinion websites. So we're trying to sort of say, how does the world look like when you view it through Christian eyes? And so trying to bring together the seen and the unseen at the same time. And so that's really what the website is trying to do.
Fantastic. And it is part of the Centre for Cultural Witness. Do you want to explain what that is as well in a nutshell? Well,
Centre for Cultural Witness is a new initiative that is based here at Lambeth Palace Library. It's sort of hosted here and within the Church of England, but its aim is not really it's not about promoting Anglicanism or the Church of England. It's about promoting Christian faith in this country. And it's about enabling people to understand the riches that Christian faith has to offer our world. We've got 2,000 years of reflection on what it means to be human, how human societies work, on who and what God is, all those kind of big questions that most of us ask from time to time. And yet very often that wisdom isn't really available or accessible to many, many people. And so this is an attempt to try to make that more accessible, to make the kind of church's voice a little bit stronger in public life these days.
Fantastic. Well, on the Re-enchanting podcast, we're aiming to sort of draw that out through the guests we have on and talk about the way their journeys and life and the work that they do in some way reflects the Christian story, even if they're not necessarily Christian themselves. You are a Christian, aren't you? Last time I looked.
Yeah. Definitely.
But we thought it would be fun each time to start with a particular question.
Yes. Yeah. So seeing as we are on the top floor of a library, not just any library, Lambeth Palace Library, we thought we'd start by asking what book you have on your bedstand at the moment. Give us a talk through that. Or books.
Books?
Plural, knowing you.
Well, I'm one of those people who kind of reads about 3 books at once. And I normally try to read probably a theology book, and maybe a novel.
Okay.
And maybe a sort of book of contemporary interest. So in those 3 categories, I guess at the moment, the book on my bedside table is a book called Rewilding the Sea by a guy called Charles Clover. It's basically about, I only just started it, so I couldn't tell you what it's all about, but a friend gave it to me, and really interesting. It was basically about how we are slowly destroying our seas through, not just through waste and plastic and everything else, but by overfishing and by damaging the ecosystem of our seas. And actually, but if we kind of left them alone, they would not only become much more healthy in their own right, but they would actually assist in the whole story of climate change anyway, because a healthy sea would absorb carbon and everything else. Anyway, it's Rewilding the Sea. That's my one book. The novel I've just finished reading, Brideshead Revisited. That's a great novel from the 1940s by Evelyn Waugh, which I think I read many years ago, but I'd forgotten about. And so I've been reading that. And then my theology book is, at the moment I'm writing a biography of Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher and apologist of the 17th century. So I'm reading a book called The Logic of the Heart, which is about Pascal and Augustine and one or two of those other figures as well. So that just gives me a little taste of my reading.
Very good.
I like the variation there.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I like the fact you've got the non-fiction, the fiction and the theology book. And you just do them all at the same time?
Yeah, different times a day.
Yeah.
So last thing at night, it's always the novel.
Yeah.
First thing in the morning, it's always the theology.
That's quite a way to wake yourself up.
Yeah, it is. Well, I'm kind of, one of
Some
those
people might say send yourself to sleep, depending on the theology book. But
Yeah, no, I find theology doesn't send me to sleep. It gets me thinking too much. And then I'm kind of awake thinking about the idea. So I need something just to kind of calm me down. Whereas first thing in the morning, I'm quite alert. And I'm a bit of a morning person.
Yeah.
So actually a good bit of sort of rich, thought-provoking theology is quite good first thing in the morning.
Great. Well, we'll ask you the same question in a year and see what books are on the bedstand.
I hope I'm still not the same
3
ones.
books, yeah. That wouldn't be a great review, would it?
It wouldn't really.
I think it was you who suggested the name of this podcast, as I seem to recall, Graham, in one of our early meetings, Re-enchanting. What made you attracted to that title?
Well, a number of things, really. One is, I guess you can't avoid that theme of enchantment. No. It's everywhere in our culture this morning. Even coming in this morning on the tube, I saw this poster about, I think it was the Royal Opera House, that was advertising, I'm not even sure what it was, but it had the big word enchanted across the top of it. And there's something about enchantment that just captures people. So I think there is a genuine desire for a kind of more enchanted world. And maybe that's a testimony to a sense that people have that life has become disenchanted. It's become people have become disenchanted with life. A sort of lack of mystery, a lack of enchantment, a lack of wonder. And so therefore it speaks into something that's quite deep within our hearts and culture. But at the same time, it also speaks, I think, also into what Christian faith can bring to the world. The last book I wrote was the one just after Wiping Yourself is a bad idea. It was a book on called Navigating a World of Grace, and the subtitle was the Promise of Generous Orthodoxy. It was a book about the Nicene Creed, and it was about how the Nicene Creed. And people often think that creeds close you down, they stop you thinking, and they give you all kinds of things you've got to believe and sign up to. But the reality is that the best creeds don't. They open out a much bigger world. So hence the title of this website, which comes from the Nicene Creed. God is the maker of all things seen and unseen. If you're a pure materialist, if you think all that is what you can see, all you're interested in is the seen. Yeah. The things you can see and feel and touch. Yeah. But actually what the Nicene Creed tells us is that God is the maker of all seen and unseen. There are all kinds of unseen realities around us. That enchanted world, which only if we only open our eyes to it, we can see. And so my hope for this podcast that it will open people's eyes to that bigger world, the unseen realities.
The sort of the more things in heaven and earth than can be dreamt of in your philosophy, Horatio.
Exactly,
sort of
exactly
view.
right.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite right.
I love that. You say we've become disenchanted. What's driven that, and what does that look like in our culture?
Well, I think it's a kind of. I think it's been going on for quite some time within our culture. I think the loss of a sense of an overarching sort of what was called a sort of sacred canopy, that idea of there being a broader, grander structure of reality that was given to us by a God who made us. And in the medieval world, they expanded that in all kinds of fantastic directions with sort of angels and demons and everything else, and all those things too. And you don't have to go in all those directions, but still there was that sense of a bigger world than just what you can see around you. And I suppose it was probably disenchanted a little bit by the scientific revolution. Science has brought us remarkable things. We wouldn't want to live in a pre-scientific world, but one of the maybe sort of byproducts of that sort of scientific discovery has been a sort of feeling that the only things that matters are the things you can explore in a test tube. And therefore, if you can't see it in a test tube, it doesn't really exist, or it doesn't matter at all. And so that's led to a sort of disenchantment, a sense that there is no mystery beyond the things that we can see and feel. Whereas actually instinctively we kind of sense we're made for something bigger and something that is unseen. So it's partly that. It's partly the reductionist approach that everything is politics, everything is power, everything is material. If that's your view of the world, then you end up with a very disenchanted world and a disenchanted heart, I think.
Yeah, and you would think that would make we would feel comfortable in disenchantment because it's a focus on things we can measure, things we can understand, things we can grasp, and things we can control. So actually that we would quite like that space, a disenchanted space. But actually, do you see a real dissatisfaction with that then?
Yeah.
A yearning for re-enchantment.
It's a really good point, Belle, that actually when we do reduce the world to things we can control, it actually becomes a much duller place.
For sure.
And it just strikes me that when you begin to imagine and live as if there are unseen realities beyond the ones that we see. And obviously, when you start to explore those, then there's all kinds of other kind of moral questions that come up to there are unseen good realities and bad realities. That's why our medieval ancestors talked about sort of angels and demons and so on. We could talk about that. That's a whole other kind of really fascinating topic. But because they realized that the unseen realities are not all benign. There are kind of dark forces that work in our world at the same time. But to deny those gives you a lack of explanatory power to explain some of the kind of mystery of being human, this extraordinary capacity we've got for goodness and creativity, but also the horrendous capacity we also have for cruelty and damage and evil and so on.
I mean, part of what we're trying to do with the Re-enchanting podcast, as you know, is to talk to guests who have all kinds of expertise, who work in fields of science and arts and culture, politics, whatever it may be, and ask, how do we re-enchant those spheres? And we've invited you on to ask, really, how do we, in a big sense, re-enchant culture? What are you hoping we'll hear in this course of hearing from various people in those different fields, and in the way that they perhaps can help us to think about how we re-enchant them? And at the end of the day, what does it have to do with, I suppose, the Christian story in the end?
Well, I guess the Christian story, I think, gives you as I was saying a moment ago, just a bigger picture of reality, and not a sort of fantastical one that's just sort of dreamt up out of nowhere, but one that's been deeply considered, thought about, pondered for centuries and millennia. As I say, 2,000 years of thinking about these things, but actually a kind of wisdom that's rather been discarded very hastily within our culture, even within the last 50 years. You sense people growing up today know actually very little about Christian faith and its content, and we rather bracket it out of our understanding of the world. So, for example, some while ago I was reading an article about John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost, and that's because he's most famous for. But he also had a particular role in the kind of English Civil War, and basically this is what the article was about. It was about his importance as a figure in English history, as a poet, as a sort of political figure, and so on. And the article didn't mention once the fact that he was a Christian. I I kind of thought, how could you understand John Milton without understanding that he was a Christian? That was absolutely core to his identity. His whole view of the world was shaped by his Christian faith. Both his politics and his poetry are sort of suffused by it. And I think where we are as a culture is because we don't really understand faith any longer. We kind of bracket it to one side and we think, well, that's not very important. What really matters is that person's approach to economics or politics or gender or whatever it is we happen to be interested in. And so that's kind of how we get. And so I suppose one of the things I'm hoping for from this podcast is that in all those different fields, whether you're talking to a historian or an economist or whatever it might be, you're able to kind of help them help others see those figures from the past, those movements, those aspects of contemporary life, with new eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to bring in that faith dimension that suddenly opens it out to a much sort of richer and sort of brighter vision of the world.
Yeah. And I guess the present as well. If you think about the present and you think about what things people are being drawn to, whether that's Charlie Mackessy's, and I've written about all of this kind of thing a lot for Seen and Unseen. So that's a good plug actually, isn't it?
Shameless plug.
You can find
check
a
out
whole
the
lot about
articles.
it. Yeah, check out the articles. The ones by Belt. No, I'm joking. The ones by all of them. They go. But, whether that's Charlie Mackessy's, short film that's been seen by 9 million people now, and it's got, so it's one of the most
That was
seen
the one that came
Oscar
out at
films.
Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely.
The horse, the boy, the mole, and the fox.
Yes.
Did I get those in the right order?
I have no
can never
idea,
remember,
but
yeah.
they are the right characters, or Stormzy's new album, or the Nick Cave and Sean O'Hagan book, the Faith, Hope and Carnage, all of these things, and some of them more explicitly Christian than others, but all of them are garnering way more popularity than I think was predicted. And perhaps it's because all of them are pointing to this, that W.H. Auden quote, there's always more than meets the eye, there's always another story. So it's like people have this craving for this,
But I think
and they
you see
don't
that
even know.
even with the popularity of, the new Lord of the Rings saga
Yes,
on Amazon
yeah.
and that sort of thing, is there's a yearning. It feels like people love sci-fi, people love fantasy. That stuff hasn't gone away. If anything, it's grown alongside the scientific revolution and the materialistic way of looking at the world. So it's almost like you've got these two competing things, and it's almost people love the fantasy side. They love that side of things, but they're kind of also wedded to this materialistic kind of, okay, but really the world isn't like that kind of way. Yeah.
And as you say, I think the longing for fantasy, you get this incredibly interesting unicorns. Have you come across this? Little girls going around with little unicorns.
They're all
on their
over the
bags.
place, aren't they?
Everywhere,
Yeah.
And you can see that sort of plays into it in some ways, but you'd look at it and think, hang on, we all know that unicorns don't exist.
Yeah.
I think they don't, do they? It's okay. I'm just looking at Belle here. Isn't she?
Don't
Right,
worry.
Justin?
Be telling me Father Christmas isn't real next.
Yeah, exactly, that's right. But there is a kind of unreal kind of yearning for the fantastic, for fantasy, almost a sort of we wish it were true, but we kind of know it isn't sort of thing. But that seems to be quite different from a kind of rich spiritual tradition that Christian faith offers, which is not just a few random people coming up with a few ideas in the last couple of decades. This is 2,000 years of people pondering this view of the world, that it comes from the entry into human history of what Christians believe God himself entered into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And that makes all the difference. And so, what does the world look like? That's the question I keep on coming back to when we think about seen and unseen and what we're trying to do in it. What does the world look like as a world where God has stepped onto the stage of his own play, as it were?
Yeah.
Or, what does this world look like as a world in which Jesus Christ has risen from the dead, and therefore death is not the last word? The world looks different if death is not the last word.
Yeah.
And our task as Christians is to describe that world,
Yeah.
to make sense of it, and to bear witness to what we see, a world where death isn't the end. And that casts its light back onto this world and makes it look different.
And as we do that with the guests that we'll be bringing on, we're not obviously saying these experiences are exclusively in the remit of Christians alone. It's obviously we're bringing on a whole different suite of people who may or may not have claims to faith, but I think who if they're not Christians per se, they're sympathetic to and understand the role that Christian faith has played in perhaps giving them the field that they now work in, or the way in which it has influenced the culture, the values, the things that they hold dear. So there's a sense in which this isn't an evangelistic project per se, but it's more, as you say, about kind of just reminding people of the story that they have lived into and that life comes out of.
Yeah, and that's a point that I think one of the guests you'll have on the podcast, Tom Holland's been making for some time now, how deeply Christian our culture is, and you can't escape it. It's kind of everywhere. And I think broadly speaking, he's right on that. And he's not the only one, but a number of people have been making that point recently of how quickly we've forgotten the Christian story, and yet it's even looking out over this skyline, there are spires and towers of churches all over the place, across the way in the Houses of Parliament. When you walk around that building, it's absolutely full of Christian iconography. It's basically a Christian building.
And yet somehow we don't always see it now. It's interesting how you only have to look up in most parts of London and you will see some kind of Christian symbolism. And yet have we become so sort of inured to it because it's become part of the furniture in that sense? I
think that's right. And, it's sometimes said that you can tell what a culture worships by the buildings it puts up. What are the big buildings when you look out on a skyline here across London, and the big cranes that are up there? What are they building? They're building office blocks, they're building banks, they're building financial institutions, they're building railways, they're building houses. They're not building churches much. But back in 150 years ago, that's exactly what they were building. They were building churches right the way across London. So buildings are a good measure. But as you say, we get used to them. We get used to those church spires that are around the place. And they are, I feel, like a symbol. I often think of where we're sitting here. You've got Lambeth Palace itself just down there, which once upon a time presumably was a dominant presence in this part of London. You would look up at this huge great palace with its towers and its prestige, and the great archbishop would live there and so on. Now, of course, it's dwarfed by all these huge, great office blocks, and
it's quite little.
It is quite small.
It's quite dinky, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I hate to say that for palace, but it is. It does feel
if you were
by London.
designing a palace now, it would look like the Gherkin or something.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not as big as Buckingham Palace. Maybe that's quite a good thing, actually. I think for a church palace.
Yeah.
It's not good for the church to have a good palace, but it's a kind of.
It reminds me more of a castle than a palace, if I'm honest.
I
don't know if you distinguish the two. But for me, it's like there's battlements, there's towers. But anyway.
But I think that's a bit of a sort of metaphor for the way in which Christian faith was once very dominant within the culture, just like Lambeth Palace dominated the landscape around here, which was largely fields and moorlands and so on. But now it sort of feels quite small compared to all these other sort of buildings around. But I guess the question is, does the vision that has inspired the banks and the office blocks, is that a vision that can really sustain people's lives over the long term and give them that sense of wider enchantment, a bigger view of life? Can it do that, or does it actually sort of shrink the soul eventually, reducing everything to money and power and sex and everything else that we tend to worship these days?
Yeah. So that sort of makes me think, and it's quite a tricky question, so you can feel free to say you have no answer to this, but if there's a deep longing in us for something more, something bigger, something richer, enchantment, if we're to believe the census results, obviously that is not translating into Christianity as an option of where to find those things. Why wouldn't it be? Why does it seem like at the same time curiosity in the transcendent things is rising, curiosity in Christianity, at least numerically, which is all we can really measure it by, is lessening it at the same time? Yeah,
it's a good question, and I think there's a number. I think there are a lot of different answers to it. But part of it, let's be honest, is that we haven't done a very good job at retelling that story in a way that's imaginative and powerful. One period of history that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently is the 1940s, which I think is the last time we did this really well as the Christian Church. Because right in the 1940s there was a big debate going on around Second World War. What's going to rebuild European civilization after the trauma of Nazism? After a very sophisticated country like Germany had descended into this barbaric regime, and Europe had been consumed by this destructive war. What is going to rebuild civilization? And Christians were right at the heart of that debate at the time. So you had people like C.S. Lewis giving broadcast talks on the radio, a sort of rather crusty academic English professor from Oxford, and those talks eventually became Mere Christianity, which was published in 1952, I think.
Yeah.
You had W.H. Auden, one of the greatest English poets of the last century, who started out not as a Christian at all, but partly by confronting the evil of Nazism, and then having to think to himself, what has got the spiritual and moral power to confront something like this, and realizing ultimately only the kind of profound riches of Christian faith had the sort of moral and spiritual ability to kind of overcome the evil of Nazism. He becomes a Christian and starts writing profoundly Christian poetry. You get T.S. Eliot doing the same thing with, the move from the wasteland of 1922, this rather bleak sort of view of the world without any great hope in it, to the Four Quartets, which again is a deeply Christian cycle of poems written in the 1940s. You get Evelyn Waugh again, Brideshead Revisited, deeply kind of Catholic author. He says at the beginning of that book, this book is about the various workings of divine grace upon particular individuals and the story of their lives. You get Dorothy Sayers writing plays about the life of Jesus, again on the radio. You got people on the continent like Simone Weil and Jacques Maritain. You had an Archbishop of Canterbury here at Lambeth, William Temple, with his ideas that partly gave birth to the welfare state. The Christian democratic movement, which gave birth to the European Union after the Second World War. In other words, these were people who really were re-enchanting their world, and they weren't by and large theologians. They were novelists and poets and one or two politicians and so on. They weren't clerics, most of them, but they were telling a rich, imaginative Christian story into their day, and that's what we're not doing, I think, at the moment. And sorry, just in your question, Belle, why is the kind of the Christian numbers disappearing while actually the spiritual interest is still there? It's because we haven't told that story very well.
We're not compelling them.
I mean, do you think there was a bump because of that post-war effort, if you like, among that group of people? Did we see that translate into numbers in church and that sort of thing?
Yeah, there was. I mean, actually, when you look at the figures of decline over the figures of church decline from the mid 19th century down to the kind of present day, the one little blip in that is the late 1940s and early 1950s, where you actually get a little bit of an upturn in the number of people going to church, confirmations, baptisms, all those kind of little measures. And I think, you can't prove these things, can you? But I think that the fact that you had these authors, these writers, these thinkers who were articulating this very kind of attractive, compelling, rich Christian vision of the world in the 1940s, in time, it led to people feeling Christian faith was something believable, credible, attractive. So then when you had these great Billy Graham campaigns that came on in the early 1950s, he, if you like, reaped the...
They primed the pump, as it were, exactly. For that. That's really interesting.
So it seems to me that, I guess what I'm saying is that I think Christian faith has a huge amount to offer our culture still, and people in our culture. And part of the thing is to kind of rediscover that source of wisdom. So often our culture goes to other faiths which have great wisdom in themselves, but we don't go back to the faith that has feels like our culture all the time.
The big thing, though, that marks our era from the post-war era that those people were speaking into, and is the 1960s counterculture, and it feels like that changed the game for me of just the way you think. Whether there is such a thing as truth, whether we are interested in values and love and morality and so on. So I guess it's not that we can just do what they did. We are speaking into a fundamentally, to some extent, different culture today, aren't we?
Yes and no. You're absolutely right. The 1960s is a big watershed in that, I think. And if you think, well, why didn't that growth continue in the 1950s? I think the 1960s is the answer.
Killed it off.
There was a whole kind of new sort of movement in the sort of student protests, in 1968, and the kind of flower power revolution, whatever you want to call it, that changed the game quite significantly. And in some ways positively, it went back on some of the kind of more crusty hierarchical kind of ways of thinking of the past. We did have deep elements of patriarchy and all those things that were not always terribly helpful. And so some of the 60s revolution was quite right and proper. But it seems to me that the Christians didn't at the time have any great answer to that. And so you don't get the figures in the 60s and 70s that you had in the 1940s. In the 1940s, they were responding to the kind of rise of this movement of Nazism across Europe and giving a profound Christian answer to that. You didn't get that in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And we haven't still got that yet, I don't think.
No.
And so the Christian story lies dormant slightly as an immense source of wisdom, but it's almost like a sort of sleeping giant within our culture. And I guess what we're trying to do here is a little bit of try to reawaken that and try to sort of see if we can find ways to retell that story in a way that captures the imagination of our friends. And
Yeah, I think, was it N.T. Wright? It might have been, who said, and I might butcher it, so apologies. If
Sorry,
ever
N.T.
listens.
Wright.
Sorry, N.T. Wright. Who said that part of the genius of Christianity is that each generation needs to sort of refigure it out. And that's not to say that it's changeable in that way, but each generation needs to refigure out how does our culture need to hear this, in what ways, what is our culture dealing with now that needs the retelling of the Christian faith, of the Christian story. So I think exactly like what you've said, maybe trying to just take a model and pop it in a different in a different decade, a different century in this case, won't work. So what do you, where do you see the hope? Where do you see the ideas? What's sparking your imagination and your hope and your excitement for the ways that this can be done for this generation in this time? Yeah.
Well, I think I'm the things that make me feel it can be done are just those little stories you hear every now and again of people who have stumbled upon Christian faith and found it something that has met a deep yearning and longing within their own hearts. I mean, I think of someone like a Paul Kingsnorth, for example, who's a well-known novelist, environmental.
We're planning to bring him on.
Oh,
exactly.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yeah, he was it should be a great conversation, because it seems to me reading the story of his discovery of Christian faith as a kind of environmental activist in the past, and yet finding within that environmental activism there was something missing at the heart of it, and yet you would describe it as a kind of discovery of a much more enchanted world through and not through any organized campaign by the church or some deliberate process, but almost stumbling upon it.
He stumbled into a few other things before. I've had the privilege of interviewing him already on his journey, and he was a sort of teenage atheist, then kind of found his way into Buddhism, then into Wicca of all things, and finally Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and I'm pretty sure he's sticking there. But he's kind of he's a fascinating character. It'd be great when we have him on the podcast to talk about his journey.
Well, that's right. And I found when I was a kind of jobbing bishop, as it were, going around doing confirmations around the area where I was responsible, it was just fascinating, because every time you would meet just a little group of you get the kind of 12-year-old children who were going through confirmation, as you do sometimes at 12. But and they were great, great to hear their sort of perspectives. But almost every time you'd also hear a number of adults who had somehow come to faith, and they'd stumbled upon this thing as this immense source of wisdom that they had suddenly discovered, and they couldn't quite believe their luck that they'd found this thing, that everybody else hadn't. And it was and so when I hear those stories, I think, this could happen again and again, not just in isolated individuals here and there, but in a kind of much more wider sense. But I think it's also that sense of we desperately need it as a culture. I mean, I've been thinking recently, we we face a number of real crises, I think, in our culture at the moment. One you could describe as a culture of as a crisis of trust. Yes. We don't really trust our leaders anymore. No. I was reading recently how the average tenure of a senior executive in a companies has got much smaller now. People would do these jobs for sort of 10, 15 years. Now it's sort of 3 or 4. Prime ministers come and go, as we know.
Getting shorter and shorter.
We don't trust our leaders. We kind of to throw them out because we don't. And that partly is maybe because We've been told that all leadership is about power, and you should always suspect those in power over you. And there's a grain of truth in that, but if it leads to a culture of suspicion, so there's a crisis of trust. There's a crisis of anxiety. It seems to me in our culture that if you think of the decade of disruption we've been through a Brexit referendum that tore us apart. We've been through a COVID pandemic that locked us down with who knows what mental impact on us all. We're now in the middle of a cost of living crisis where we can't even afford to heat our homes a lot of the time.
And technology is rewiring all our brains, apparently.
Exactly, that's right. And we've got war happening in Europe, on our doorstep, and with the threat of that, many analysts saying that there could be a third world war on the way if China gets involved, on the side of Russia. Defense spending across European countries is going up all the time. And there's a crisis of relationship as well, in that we become so polarized in our nation. And Twitter is just full of arguments between one side and the other, which just is. And in one sense, you could describe those three things as a crisis of faith, trust, a crisis of hope that we don't have any hope for the future, and a crisis of love that we don't know how to love each other. Now, actually, Christians, we kind of know a bit about faith, hope, and love. And actually, Christian faith is the kind of thing that if you live in it, take it seriously over time, it'll teach you to trust people. It'll give you hope for the future. It'll enable you to love people that you find difficult to love. And that's why I think I sense there's a need for this, because our culture desperately needs faith, hope, and love. And that's exactly what we've been talking about for 2,000 years. It's there, but it's not often told as a story, or not in a way that compels people.
I guess my next question is a little bit of a loaded one, but the Centre for Cultural Witness is a project of the Church of England, and obviously the Church of England is one of our best known institutions in the UK and has been trying to tell that Christian story and remind people of it in various ways over the centuries. Of course, we find ourselves at this point, the point we're recording, where there are some fractious debates going on sexuality, identity, and so on in the Church of England. That is your tribe. And is the Church of England the best place to be trying to bring this message of reminding ourselves of the hope of the Christian story, when it sometimes kind of looks a bit like the culture around it in terms of how people are falling out with each other?
It's a very valid question, and someone was saying to me the other day, is this a good time to be starting something like this? And the Church of England seems to be falling out.
I bet you loved that conversation.
Well, my answer was partly, this is exactly the sort of time we should be starting something like this. No, I'm not saying that those debates don't matter. They do matter. They go deep to the heart of Christian faith, sense of identity, of who we are, how God has made us, and so on. And they're really important debates to tease out, work out, find ways forward, whether the church can hold together or needs to have some kind of, however it works out. That's to be worked out, and that's not the focus of our conversation. But I suppose a couple of things on that. One thing is that it seems to me the way in which Christians have those debates is going to be really important. The Christian church has always been on the brink of schism. You could almost take every single century in the 2000 till the 200 centuries we've had of Christian faith, and there's been some issue at the heart of it, which has seemed to be just about to split the church right down the middle. Crucial thing is, it's not that we're all agreed, everyone agrees on everything. We've never really done that as a Christian church. We've always had different interpretations of stuff. The question is partly, how do we do those debates? Can we do those in a way that is more healthy and constructive and less personally demeaning and destructive of relationships and people? I was intrigued by seeing an MP who'd watched the General Synod debate, which was passionate and deeply held convictions being debated. And he said, well, actually, Parliament could learn quite a lot from the grace and the respect that was shown mostly during that debate, which I took to be a good sign that, that there are some real hard debates going on in the Church of England at the moment, but if we can do those debates in a way that that is healthier than sometimes.
The problem always seems to be, as soon as the debate transfers from that face-to-face encounter with a real person to the online world, it quickly starts to look like the rest of the world,
exactly,
isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. And I think the other thing is, how do we how do we manage difference
Yeah.
within the church? Because I think the differences on these issues they go pretty deep, and we're not suddenly going to agree on everything, and they're fairly irreconcilable. And so you've got to find a way to manage that. And I guess that's the challenge from here on. Can Christians, can the church, and the Church of England's not the only church going through these issues. Every church is going through it as well. Can the Church of England find a way to manage that difference in as healthy and Christian and positive a way as possible? Not glossing over it, pretending it doesn't matter, but actually handling difference well. Because that's what we're struggling to do in our culture more generally. I do think, just to go to that, I do think that the loss of the Christian story is part of why we've become more polarized.
Okay.
Be like in the world where there was a general sense that there was a God, there was an order which he had given within the world, and we all fitted in with that order. We all had our different political opinions and approaches and so on, but they were kind of held within a broader structure. My political opinions were penultimate, not ultimate. Yeah. Now we've sort of stripped away that sense of there being a broader story, a God who oversees and everything and to whom everything returns eventually. My political opinions become ultimate, not penultimate. Therefore, they become the only thing that matters. And therefore, if you have a different political opinion, you are my enemy.
Yeah.
Rather than someone held within the love of God, as it were.
I said I wanted to mention the title of that book, Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea. And for me, that's partly what the book was about, the fact that we live in a culture now where everyone has to invent their own identity, their own story, if you like. Be yourself is the mantra. But that's actually quite a difficult thing because when we take away that big story that used to define many people, it did at least give a coherence, a narrative for people to kind of live their lives by. Do you feel like is that in a sense why being yourself is a bad idea? Because actually it's really difficult to be a single individual in a world awash with different ideas.
Well, I think it is partly that. I think it's partly because ultimately we're not made just to be pure individuals. And the problem with the be yourself advice, which is of course everywhere when you look for it, that's the kind of number one commandment of modern life, be yourself. And the assumption behind that is you have to look inside yourself to your own thoughts and desires and feelings and so on to discover who you really are. The problem with that is it turns you inside, turns you inwards rather than outwards.
Yeah.
And it breeds a whole world and generation of people who try to sort of be themselves, to find themselves by looking within, rather than finding themselves by looking without to their friends, neighbors, family, and to God. Because, again, within the Christian faith, we're told that to be truly human is to be able to love God and to love your neighbor. And yes, there's a loving yourself within that, love your neighbor as yourself. But what that seems to be saying is, what I need to make sure that, if I love myself, I make sure that I've got food and shelter and education and all the things that I need. I'm as determined that you have that as much as I do. That's what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. So in other words, we find our true selves in relationship to God and to one another, not just on our own as individuals. And that's why be yourself is not really a very good idea, because it just makes you look in the wrong place. And actually, where we'd find our true selves only in relationship. And that's really what the kind of core idea is at the heart of the book.
Which again is disenchantment versus re-enchantment, or seen versus unseen. It's there might be something comforting in defining ourselves by what we do, and by looking inward and the stuff we can measure. But actually, we becoming really disenchanted with that, really dissatisfied with that. That actually, the burden of having to build and then define and then sustain ourselves in our own image actually is exhausting, and we are desperately looking for something else. And again, where are we finding that then? Are we finding that in political parties? Are we finding that in, tribalism? Are we finding that in, a sports team? Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but it is that. It's like it's that craving of an identity that we can tie ourselves into that's bigger than anything we can sustain.
And I don't know if you've come across Alan Noble and some of his writing, but he wrote a great book recently, which again tied in so much to what you said in your own book, Graham, where he was talking about the kind of intolerable burden of modern culture on especially young people, of having to essentially reinvent themselves every few years. And he as a college professor sees, just the rates of anxiety and everything, and he very much sees that as tied to the loss of this bigger story, that you can't just kind of step into that bigger story. Every story is competing. You have to kind of build your own identity and so on.
And it's not just exhausting, it's also expensive.
Yes.
Because a lot of it, let's be honest, is driven by commercial interests. People want to sell you stuff.
Of course.
Because to reinvent yourself means to have a different look, to have a different set of clothes, to have a different kind of, activities that you do. A lot of it is driven by a kind of commercial economic model that actually benefits from constant reinvention. Doesn't want you to stay the same. Doesn't want you to actually just find your meaning in relationships with others, but actually wants you to find your meaning in the things that you own and you spend and you buy. And so, you can't ignore the kind of economic aspects of that cultural shift towards being yourself. It sounds like a kind of very sort of nice mystical idea, but actually there's a lot of hard-edged economic interests in play here as well.
I mean, if there was one moment which I think collectively we all stepped back a bit from those stories and thought about a bigger picture, it was definitely the death of Queen Elizabeth II. And I remember at the time you wrote some interesting stuff around that, Graham, about the way that I think you were out sort of being a pastor to the line along with other people from Lambeth to the big queue that filed past the coffin. And I remember you saying that it felt like suddenly a kind of latent spirituality kind of bubbled to the surface as people suddenly felt the import of this moment and this event and the passing of an era and so on. So it's not that wanting to be part of something bigger has gone away. It feels like it's still there, ready to be tapped potentially.
No, I think that is right, and you saw it at that moment of real vulnerability in our nation. Suddenly this figure that was the only monarch we'd ever known, most of us, suddenly she wasn't there, and that sense of permanence, something permanent in our lives had disappeared. And so, because so much else is fast changing and ephemeral, she was at least a symbol of stability, that she had always been there every FA Cup final and Trooping of the Colour and Queen's birthday and Christmas Day.
How many prime ministers had she seen come and gone? I can't remember now.
Yeah, she was just that symbol of permanence, and you took that away, and we sort of suddenly felt the lack of it, and you felt this yearning for permanence, and that's why some of the ceremony, the ceremonial kind of was a reassuring thing, because it reminded you there's something longer than our own lifetimes and bigger than our own stories that we are rooted in. And I think at that moment, you suddenly saw people, we kind of need permanence. We need longevity. We need something bigger than ourselves. We need a set of values that will hold us. And she kind of represented those in her own character. And so I think it was one of those moments that uncovered that deep yearning for the permanent, for the lasting, for the transcendent.
And I think
it's surprising how quickly it moves on.
It does, inevitably. But just for a moment, it felt like the Christian story suddenly bubbled up, because obviously the Queen herself was a woman of great Christian faith. But there was just that sense, because we were marking the passing of someone from this world into the world to come. And I just felt, seeing all those people wanting to pay their respects, file past, stand for hours in a queue. And when they got to that moment of facing the coffin, searching for something meaningful to do or say or cross themselves. Even, I'm sure many people who, rarely set foot in a church, but they wanted to mark it, this as being significant in some way, didn't they?
No, definitely. Yeah. And you saw all kinds of people, staunch Republicans and staunch atheists doing things you never would have thought they would have done at that moment. And it wasn't just sort of, ardent royalists flag waving all the time. It was kind of almost everybody. I mean, not almost everybody, but it testified to that deep yearning and yearning for sort of symbols and activities and things that you could do at a moment of great. And I suppose the other thing about it was a kind of reminder of our own mortality too. A very public death like that. Makes you realise that it's going to happen to all of us one day. One day it'll be your funeral and yours and mine. And they'll be walking away and they'll leave us in the grave. And yet, so much of modern life is designed not to make us think about that moment.
Just to ignore that.
I was saying earlier on, really writing a book about Pascal at the moment, and he couldn't quite get why people didn't think about that. It was the one.
Oh, okay.
It was the one sort of absolutely sure thing that you can say about everyone's future is the fact that one day they will die. But how much time do you spend thinking about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the Queen's funeral was a moment where we were brought face to face with our own vulnerability, frailty, mortality. That in one sense, yes, she was the Queen, but in another sense, she was an ordinary sinner like you and me. She was a frail old lady who was put into a grave like we will all be one day. And so, it was when suddenly you're faced with your own vulnerability, you need something bigger than that to hold you.
Yeah.
And that's what Christian faith offered at that moment. And it's what it still offers to people today. But as we've been discussing, we need to find better ways of explaining that, exploring it, depicting it.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Well, it seems like an appropriate place probably to start to wind today's episode up.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Graham, for being with us.
It's been a pleasure.
We're looking forward to finding other ways through the guests we speak to in this podcast, aren't we, Belle, of how we see those echoes of the Christian story, not necessarily something as massive as the death of Queen Elizabeth, but in all kinds of ways we want to help to bring out to the surface the way in which the Christian story is still shaping our stories and the way in which we could see the re-enchanting of our culture through that story.
Yes, absolutely. And the places that are missing it. I think that's important as well. The places that are crying out for it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you
Justin.
very much,
Thank you,
Graham.
Pleasure, thank you.
Well, I think it went quite well, Belle.
I think
First
we did
episode.
okay.
I think we've cracked that one. Thank you very much for watching, for listening. If you want more from Re-enchanting, then you can find us with more guests in the future as we continue to broadcast more episodes of the podcast. Seenandunseen.com is the place to go.
Seenandunseen.com.
But for now, thank you very much for being with us, Graham.
Bye.
You.